In sleep he sang to me, in dreams he came, that voice which calls to me and speaks my name. And do I dream again? For now I find the Phantom of the Opera is there inside my mind. The Phantom of the Opera. What is this story about? I was introduced to this tale in middle school, actually, when I played the violin. Our orchestra played a suite, a combination of these songs for a concert, and I didn't know the story at the time, and our instructor kept telling us to play with passion, with emotion in these different sections, and I had no frame of reference for understanding what she was talking about, what she was referring to. And then when I got older, I actually got to see the film, and I enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the story. But I recently got a chance to watch it again. I'm speaking of the 2014, I believe. It might be slightly older than that. But anyways, the film version with starring Gerard Butler as the Phantom, and which I unfortunately I haven't gotten to see the opera itself or the musical, but I'm sure the storyline is similar enough. The music is the same, and that's what I want to go into, because the story is in the music, and there's a lot more to it than the superficial story that is presented to the audience on the surface. So what's that? Let's start with the basic plot line. Young woman named Christine is a ballet dancer in an opera house in the late 19th century in Paris. And the prima donna suffers a crisis of ego and departs from the stage. And so this young girl, Christine, it is revealed that she has been taking private lessons in singing and actually has quite a good voice. And so she comes and sings the song and just bewitches everyone with the beauty of her voice, which is not in the film. It is not presented as a normal classical opera voice, just as the Phantom of the Opera's own voice is not a classical opera voice by any means. Just listen to any opera and you'll know these are almost closer to contemporary what you would hear on the radio, but it's somewhere between the two. But I digress. So she rises to stardom, and as she does so, she finally attracts the attention of a man who had not noticed her before, the Viscount, who has been named Raoul, who has taken over as a patron of the arts and of the opera house in question. And he notices her when she becomes a star. And suddenly they, a love sort of begins to blossom between those two, which of course makes her teacher jealous. Her teacher has himself begin to fall in love with her for the same reason, for her music. More on that shortly. And so, of course, and plot spoilers, of course, I'm personally of the opinion that plot spoilers don't spoil good stories. They only spoil mediocre ones, but that's just me. But you've been warned. So after her instructor, her teacher in singing, the Phantom of the Opera, whose name we never really learn, interestingly, decides to declare war on both of them. And he does this in a very interesting way. He writes his own opera and says to the opera house, you will perform this opera or else, bad things will continue to happen. As he had been causing to happen when things didn't go his way before. And so the opera that he writes is a variation of Don Juan, also known as Don Giovanni in the Italian stream, which is an opera I have gotten to see and very much enjoyed. It is a classic operatic piece, probably one of the most popular operas ever. And it has many different variations and versions. But the core story is it follows a young man, a womanizer, named Don Juan, or Don Giovanni, same character, who is going around seducing all these women, leaving a trail of destruction behind him. And eventually, he ends up killing the father of one of the women he's slept with in a duel. And at one point, he invites this man, the statue of this dead man, to dinner, and he comes. The statue comes to dinner and drags Don Juan down to hell. But it's the story. This opera is a story about seduction and descent into hell. Is the culmination, and we see, and this leads us into, of course, the apparent story resolves with, of course, after Christine takes his mask off in the middle of the opera and reveals who he is to the crowd. He takes her down into his lair, and Raoul chases after them, and the Phantom captures him and threatens to hang him if Christine chooses Raoul over him. And of course and this conclusion may not make sense at the superficial level, but we're about to dive deeper, don't worry. She basically tells the Phantom, you're not alone, and she kisses him, and at that point he says, forget it all, run you two, because now the police and the entire city is chasing through the burning labyrinthian dungeon of this opera house looking for him. And so the Raoul and Christine escape, and the Phantom just kind of disappears. And that's the apparent story in a nutshell. But let's I think there are two deeper layers of interpretation we could go into. And the first deeper layer of interpretation we can go into begins with the name of the protagonist, or perhaps arch antagonist, depending on your take. The Phantom of the Opera. What does that mean? Why does he get this title? Is he called a phantom just because he hides himself and is difficult to see? Possibly. But a phantom is a spirit. And the opera is music. And when you look at the lyrics of a lot of the score that Sir Andrew Lloyd Webber had written for this musical, the lyrics don't make sense if you view him as just a man. The Phantom of the Opera is there inside your mind. Do I dream again, for there I find the Phantom of the Opera is in my mind. This subject of him being in your head keeps coming up over and over in the lyrics, not just of the main thematic track, but also in the music of the night and in my own personal favorite, which is the Point of No Return. And you see him saying, all of your defenses are down. You've succumbed to me. And all these kinds of very strange phrases that almost intuitively make sense in the context of a romantic relationship between two people. But given even a moment's thought, they just don't. Even if he's some weird master hypnotist, That's not how hypnotists even talk with people. They're more subtle. And lest you think I'm overanalyzing this, if we return again to the title, we have a much better explanation. The Phantom of the Opera is the spirit of operatic music itself. The Phantom of the Opera is a man, but he is also the spirit, the essence, the soul of the opera, perhaps even of music. And this explains things like, his arrogant claim that it is my opera house to the two new owners when he is demanding his salary. He is the source and the soul of the music, of the talent. He's the heart and the passion behind what makes this music itself. And that's why Christine's music, Christine, who he has personally instructed, doesn't sound like classical opera, but nevertheless conveys the feeling of opera even better than the classically trained prima donna. And so what you are getting in the conflict between specifically the Phantom of the Opera and Raoul is a conflict in part between the people who create the music, the heart and soul of music, versus the people who fund it and put it on. And of course, the audience is being at times divided between these two in terms of who gets credit for this creation. And that creation is Christine. Christine is the angel of music. It isn't the Phantom. It's Christine. And there are... And this actually ties into the second, deeper level of interpretation. And this one is a little bit more esoteric, maybe a little bit more reaching. But I think I think it could be defensible if I were to take the time to actually write this out someday, which I might. I was originally going to write this out, but I didn't have the time, so I figured I would just do a video. But that aside, the third interpretation, there's the base, superficial presentation of the plot. That's interpretation 1. Interpretation 2, the Phantom of the Opera is the spirit of the opera. He is the music itself. The third interpretation is the Phantom of the Opera is that passionate, emotive source for where that music comes from. And what do I mean by that? If we compare the Phantom, the character of the Phantom, by contrast with the character of Raoul. Let's start with Raoul. Raoul is an aristocrat. He is a well-to-do, almost Ken doll-looking man of the city and of civilization. He is the embodiment of the security of the civilized world. The Phantom is very much the opposite of that. He is dressed up and disguised as an aristocrat. He puts on the clothes of an aristocrat, which he sort of disparages in one of the more moving little sub-songs towards the end. Unfeeling scrap of clothing. But, and of course the mask itself. But beneath that, he appears half monster. Not full monster, but half monster. And he is a tortured soul. He is suffering tremendously from his childhood, from his appearance, and from the contradiction between his appreciation for beauty and its absence in his face. And so that's why he desires to create Christine, to create beauty, the beauty that he dreams of. And it is from this intense suffering and even deformity that this great art and beauty comes from. And I think it goes to an older, pre-civilized world as well. I've been reading a tremendous amount about the Iliad, about Homeric poetry and the world of Bronze Age Greece and the Trojan War and so forth. And the Iliad of Homer, people think of classics as very high language, Victorian. Maybe they've read the Pope translation of the Iliad, which is this horrendously highbrow translation that hides a lot of the brutality. But the rawness of the Iliad is what makes it so beautiful. And in that exact same fashion, and then the Iliad, of course, was maybe not sung exactly, but recited in a very musical manner. And it is a very musical story, for lack of a better term. It was written in a song culture where people sang their laments and they sang their songs of victory. Nostos, the return home in the Odyssey, is not just the return home. It is the song about returning home. Kleos, the glory of Achilles, is not just glory. It is the song about glory that Achilles is hoping to achieve and to have written about him one day. It is very song-oriented, and these songs come from a place of tremendous sadness. And that sadness often comes from a place of trauma and deformity and ugliness and barbarism, for lack of a better term. Perhaps an analogy to the Phantom of the Opera character from more contemporary fiction is Hannibal Lecter from the Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris. And so you have a kind of civilization versus pre-civilization. And what we see in the opera, and Nietzsche has a unbelievably difficult but a very good book for those who are interested called The Birth of Tragedy. It was his first book, and it was about the way that tragic plays in Greece represented what he called an Apollonian presentation of a Dionysian truth, which is to say, basically, a civilized form of presentation of an uncivilized or maybe pre-civilized worldview. And that is exactly what we see in the Phantom of the Opera. With the Phantom, who is both a man and the spirit of the music, and also this pre-civilized, uncivilized, intensely suffering persona who creates beauty from his place of suffering. That persona must remain hidden if it is to be appreciated by the audience. But why would the audience want to appreciate this? Why would the audience want connection to this deformed character? The short answer is because they all feel the same emotions. And in this civilized world where everything is nice and neat, they might feel very intensely alone. They might feel like they don't belong here, that civilization is not for them, or that they're not worthy of civilization, perhaps. And so the Phantom of the opera presents these pre-civilized emotive expressions of pain and suffering and grief, pity and fear, to borrow from Aristotle, in such a way that people can connect with them, but hidden behind a mask of civility, such that the civilization itself isn't shattered by the truth, by the power of the music of the night, by the fact that we are not civilized humans underneath, that we are half monsters, that we are thousands of people in a masked parade pretending to be civilized. And there's the film does a brilliant job illustrating this symbolically. When Raoul goes down after the Phantom, when he presents himself in the masquerade ball, and the Phantom just drops down into the floor and Raoul jumps in after him with his sword, what does he meet? He meets a hall of mirrors. He meets a hall of images looking back at him. When he pursues the Phantom with violence, he sees himself staring back. He is the monster in that moment. And the noose represents which he is barely rescued from, represents the almost self-destructive potential within the opera if civilization chases it too far down the rabbit hole of what's actually going on here. And this, I think, is the only thing that explains this strange conclusion, where Raoul has a noose around his neck, and the Phantom of the opera has the noose and is ready to kill him. And he says, "Make your choice. You're trying my patience. Make your choice." And Christine says in response to this, between the Phantom, between the music, the pre-civilized passion and torment of suffering, and the civilization, bland, naive security of civilization, what does she do? She says, "Wretched creature of darkness, what kind of life have you known? God gave me courage to show you you are not alone." And somehow that connection resolves it all. And he says, "Go now, forget what you have seen here." And the rest of the lyrics in his song are essentially addressed to the audience, just as they are in Past the Point of No Return, where the play within a play is, of course, him telling the audience, "You who have come here voluntarily and opened your minds to me," the audience, not Christine, "you have succumbed to me, dropped all your defenses," and so forth. It is all spoken to the audience, and it's absolutely brilliant. There's a lot more that could be said about it, but I hope I've given you enough to ponder on, maybe make some of your own connections, and I would highly encourage everyone to go watch it again. It is one of those movies, one of those stories that I think might be with us quite some time. Anyways, take care.